The sound of Frank Dawson's footsteps echoed against the quiet suburban street. It was a brisk, sunlit morning, the kind that always seemed too perfect for the kind of misfortune he would soon face. His golden retriever, Buddy, pulled gently on the leash as they walked down the familiar path. Frank, with his silver hair and deep-set eyes, looked like the kind of man who had seen it all, and perhaps, for a while, he believed he had. But that morning would change everything. As Frank made his way across the sidewalk, something felt off. His steps seemed just a little heavier than usual. He shifted his weight slightly, but before he could adjust, his right foot slipped out from under him. His body lurched forward, and the world seemed to pause as he pitched toward the ground. The sidewalk came up too fast. A sickening thud filled the air as Frank landed hard on his side. Buddy barked in alarm, pacing around his fallen owner, unsure of what to do. Frank's breath caught in his chest, and for a moment, he simply lay there, staring at the sky as if trying to process what had just happened. Pain shot through his hip, and then, his wrist, both of which felt as though they'd been shattered by the sudden impact. Was this really happening? Was he really going to be one of those old folks who couldn't even walk down the street without falling? Frank attempted to rise, but his body betrayed him. The pain was too intense. His mind swirled in confusion, and panic began to set in. He lay there for what felt like an eternity before he finally managed to get to his knees. His dog, Buddy, continued to bark in distress, but Frank's thoughts were too clouded to do much about it. Why did this happen? His shoes, the ones he'd worn for years without issue, were now his enemy. He looked down at them, cheap, worn-out sneakers that he'd picked up on a sale years ago. They had once felt comfortable enough, but now, they were a reminder of his own stubbornness. His body ached with a sharpness that reminded him, he was no longer a young man. "Come on, Frank," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the dizziness. "You're not a kid anymore. You need to be smarter." With all the effort he could muster, Frank finally managed to stand, clutching the nearby tree for support. His chest tightened, his heartbeat erratic. As Buddy continued to whine, Frank took a slow, shaky step forward, trying to regain his composure. The next few minutes felt like a blur. His legs felt weak, and his breath came in shallow gasps. "I'm fine. I'm fine," Frank whispered, more to himself than to Buddy. It wasn't until he was safely inside his house that he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. He collapsed onto his worn-out armchair, clutching his wrist, which was now swelling. His fingers trembled as he tried to press down on the aching spot, but the pain only worsened. This isn't right. This wasn't supposed to be how it ended, was it? He wasn't supposed to be helpless, unable to walk a few steps without risking his life. The phone on the coffee table buzzed, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. It was a text from his daughter, Sophia. "Dad, I'll be home tomorrow. Don't overdo it, okay? Take care of yourself." Frank sighed, staring at the screen. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew his daughter was right. He hadn't been taking care of himself. Ever since Marla, his wife, gone too soon, passed away, he had given up on taking care of himself. No more runs, no more trips to the gym, no more doctor's appointments. He lived like someone waiting for time to catch up to him, taking the slow route down a path he never thought he'd be on. "Take care of myself," he muttered bitterly. How could he take care of himself if he wasn't even willing to admit there was a problem? He looked back at the sneakers he'd worn that morning. What had seemed like a harmless choice had just knocked him to the ground. Shoes. A simple, everyday item. And yet, they had betrayed him in a way he never saw coming. He couldn't help but wonder, how many other seniors like him were falling into the same trap? How many of them, like him, had stubbornly ignored the signs that their bodies and their habits were no longer the same as they once were? Frank closed his eyes, taking a long, shaky breath as the weight of the situation settled on his chest. His life had changed in a matter of seconds, and now, with nothing more than a slip, he realized just how fragile it all really was. The question that lingered in his mind as he looked out the window, lost in thought, was one he didn't have an answer to. What if a pair of shoes could kill you? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Dawson had always been the kind of man who stood tall, even when the world seemed to push him down. But standing tall was something he hadn't done in years, not since the night Marla died. He still remembered that evening in vivid detail, the sharp edge of the wind, the sense of finality that hung in the air as the paramedics arrived, and how his world, once bustling with laughter and love, suddenly felt too quiet. Too still. They had been a team, he and Marla. From the moment they met in college to the years they spent raising Sophia, Frank had always been the steady hand and Marla the spark of light. He couldn't remember a time when their partnership felt anything less than perfect. She was the reason he'd stayed grounded, the reason he'd pushed through the toughest projects at work, the reason he always found his way back home after a long day. When she was taken from him in a car accident, just a random moment of fate, Frank's world stopped. He hadn't just lost his wife, he had lost his reason to try anymore. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly adrift, without direction, without purpose. Sophia, their only daughter, had been living in San Francisco by then, working as a designer for a tech company. Frank had never understood exactly what she did, but he had always been proud of her. She was the kind of person who could thrive anywhere, someone who seemed to know exactly where she was headed. But that was before the accident. Sophia's first few visits after Marla's death had been filled with the kind of concern only a daughter can show for her father. She brought over casseroles, checked on his well-being, and kept reminding him that he needed to take care of himself. But Frank was stubborn. He didn't want her to see him weak. And so, he withdrew. Slowly at first, then completely. He stopped returning her calls. He stopped going to the doctor. He even let the house fall into disrepair, allowing dust to settle in places where it hadn't been before. He wasn't ready to move on. He wasn't ready to be anything other than the man who had lost his wife. He couldn't be anything else. He remembered the last argument they'd had, just before Sophia stopped calling so often. "Dad, you can't just shut yourself off from the world. You have to live again," she'd said, her voice trembling with frustration. "I'm not asking you to forget Mom. I'm asking you to start living for yourself. For me. For your future." Frank had shut down then, retreating into a quiet bitterness that he didn't know how to shake. He didn't know how to let go of Marla, not when she was everywhere, her smile in the kitchen, her voice in the old songs they used to play, even her clothes still hanging in the closet. But Sophia had left, and Frank was left with only the silence. And then, one day, he met Buddy. The dog had been abandoned at a shelter on a rainy afternoon, and Frank, against his better judgment, decided to adopt him. It wasn't that Frank loved dogs, he'd never been much of an animal person, but something about Buddy's sad eyes, those big brown eyes full of longing, reminded him of the loneliness he felt deep in his bones. From that day on, Buddy was his constant companion, his silent friend who asked for nothing more than a walk in the park or a treat at the end of the day. For the first time in a long time, Frank felt like he wasn't completely alone. Buddy was the reason Frank finally left the house some mornings, even if it was just to get the mail or walk around the block. He couldn't let the dog suffer in the same way he did. Buddy's presence, simple and pure, was a reminder that there was still life outside of grief. Still a chance, maybe, to start again. But the more Frank retreated into his own world, the more the weight of his past pressed down on him. His legs grew weaker. His joints ached. His once sharp mind now felt fuzzy, like it was wrapped in cotton. And the shoes, those worn-out sneakers, seemed to symbolize everything wrong with the way he was living. They had once been comfortable, like an old friend. But now, they were just a reminder of the man who was too stubborn to move forward. The man who still, in so many ways, felt like he was standing still, waiting for something or someone to make him feel whole again. Frank had avoided the doctor for so long, believing that the physical pain was just a part of getting older. It was easier to pretend it didn't matter, easier to bury himself in his memories of Marla, rather than admit that he might need help, real, tangible help, to change his future. But as he lay on the ground that morning, struggling to regain his balance after the fall, the truth hit him harder than any injury ever could. He couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't keep ignoring the warning signs that his body was failing him, that his own stubbornness was taking a toll on his health, and ultimately, on his life. There was a world out there beyond the confines of his grief. He just had to find a way to take that first step. But that first step felt like the hardest thing in the world. The pain in Frank's wrist was unbearable. He tried to shake it off, tried to convince himself it was nothing more than a minor sprain, but the swelling didn't lie. His wrist was more than just bruised, it was injured. The fall had been worse than he wanted to admit, and he knew that ignoring it would only make things worse. But that wasn't the hardest part. No, the hardest part was the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just a freak accident. Frank's body was no longer what it once was, and the evidence was staring him in the face. He had tried to push it all down, burying his fears with distractions, his television, his books, his walks with Buddy. But now, with his wrist throbbing and his body sore from the fall, Frank couldn't ignore the truth. He was getting older, and he had stopped taking care of himself. He had become too comfortable in his own decline, unwilling to face what he knew was coming. As he sat there on the couch, his injured wrist resting on a cold pack, Frank thought back to the last time he saw his doctor, Dr. Mendez. It had been over a year since that visit. A year in which he'd ignored every piece of advice given to him, dismissed every warning sign. At the time, Dr. Mendez had told him his cholesterol was high, his blood pressure creeping up, and that he needed to start taking better care of his body. Frank had nodded, thanked the doctor, and promised to work on it. But in the back of his mind, he'd thought, I'm not one of those old people who get sick. I'm fine. He hadn't been fine. Not by a long shot. Frank reached for his phone, hesitated for a moment, and then dialed Sophia's number. It rang 3 times before she answered. Dad? Is everything okay? Sophia's voice crackled through the phone, filled with concern. Frank hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, he didn't want to be that person, the father who called every time something went wrong. But the words tumbled out before he could stop them. I fell today, Frank admitted, the weight of the words sinking in. Twisted my wrist. I'm fine, but it just made me realize something. Sophia was quiet for a moment, and then he heard the soft sigh on the other end of the line. Dad, you need to take care of yourself. You can't just ignore this stuff. I'm coming home tomorrow. We'll talk about this then. Frank closed his eyes, the guilt creeping up his spine. Sophia had been telling him the same thing for months, but he had been too proud to listen. He didn't want her to think he was weak, and he definitely didn't want her to pity him. But now, lying here with his injured wrist and a growing realization that he couldn't ignore his health forever, Frank knew he had to make a choice. He couldn't go on like this. But what was the alternative? To admit that he needed help. To finally face the fact that he wasn't invincible. That he couldn't keep avoiding the truth that had been right in front of him all this time. His thoughts were interrupted by Buddy, who jumped up onto the couch beside him and nudged Frank's hand with his cold nose. Frank smiled weakly, running his good hand through Buddy's soft fur. The dog's companionship was a small comfort in the midst of all his turmoil. What am I going to do, Buddy? Frank murmured. The dog tilted his head and looked at him with those wide, understanding eyes, as though offering silent support. But Frank knew that Buddy, for all his loyal companionship, couldn't solve his problems. Only Frank could do that. The day dragged on, with Frank alternating between resting his wrist and staring out the window, lost in thought. As the evening sun began to dip behind the trees, Frank finally decided he had to take the first step. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. His body, his health, was too important to keep neglecting. With a sigh, Frank grabbed his phone again. This time, he searched for Dr. Mendez's office and dialed the number. The next morning, Frank sat nervously in the waiting room of Dr. Mendez's office, his heart pounding in his chest. He had put this off for far too long, and now here he was, finally facing the consequences of his neglect. "Mr. Dawson," a nurse called, breaking his thoughts. "Dr. Mendez will see you now." Frank stood up, his legs a little unsteady, and followed the nurse down the hallway to the examination room. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the walls were adorned with pictures of happy families and health tips. Frank settled into the sterile, paper-covered chair, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in his stomach. He didn't want to be here, but he knew he had to be. Dr. Mendez walked in, a friendly middle-aged woman with a warm smile. She immediately noticed the concern in Frank's eyes, and her smile faltered slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Dawson," she said, pulling up a stool next to him. "What brings you in today?" Frank hesitated for a moment before answering. I fell yesterday. Hurt my wrist. But it's not just that. I've been feeling weaker. My joints hurt, and I can't seem to keep up anymore." Dr. Mendez nodded thoughtfully, her expression becoming more serious. "Let's take a look at that wrist first, and then we can talk about the other symptoms." As the doctor examined his wrist, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that he was finally being forced to confront the truth he had been avoiding for so long: he was no longer in control. He was no longer the man who could handle everything on his own. And for the first time in a long while, that thought terrified him. Frank sat in Dr. Mendez's office, trying not to squirm under her watchful eyes. The doctor's words had sunk in deeper than he was willing to admit. "You've got some muscle weakness in your joints, Frank," Dr. Mendez said, looking over his medical chart. "That's likely causing the pain in your wrists, your knees, and your lower back. It's common in older adults who haven't been active or have let their fitness levels drop for too long. I understand it's hard, but I need you to make some serious lifestyle changes." Frank swallowed hard, trying to process the flood of information. Lifestyle changes. That was the last thing he wanted to hear. He had spent years avoiding anything that felt like a change. The thought of taking a different path now, at his age, was intimidating. He'd grown accustomed to his routine. His world, even with the loneliness, had become predictable. "So, what are you suggesting?" Frank finally managed to ask, his voice low. "Well," Dr. Mendez began, leaning forward slightly, "I'm recommending physical therapy for your joint pain. That, combined with some light cardio and strength exercises, should help. We also need to get your blood pressure under control and address your cholesterol. I'll write you a referral for a dietitian and a physical therapist. But you have to stick to this plan if you want to see results, Frank. Your body is telling you it needs help." Frank nodded slowly, trying to absorb everything. It felt overwhelming. The idea of exercise, of committing to a routine, seemed so distant, so foreign to him. He hadn't exercised in years. And the dietitian? He chuckled darkly to himself. The only diet he followed was whatever happened to be convenient in the moment. Fast food, pre-packaged meals, whatever he could grab while in his fog of self-pity. He wasn't sure he was ready for the discipline that came with real change. "I'll do it," Frank said finally, more to placate the doctor than because he truly believed in himself. "I'll try." "Good," Dr. Mendez replied with a small smile. "This is your chance to take back control of your health, Frank. You have the power to make these changes. Don't wait until it's too late." Frank could feel the weight of those words as he left the office, the cool air outside seeming to match his uneasy thoughts. He wasn't sure what had changed in him since yesterday's fall, but something was stirring. He wasn't ready to admit it yet, but for the first time in a long time, he was starting to think maybe he could do something about his situation. Buddy, ever loyal, was waiting in the car when Frank got back. The dog jumped up to lick his face as Frank opened the door, and for a moment, the simplicity of Buddy's affection was almost overwhelming. "I don't know, Buddy," Frank said quietly, stroking the dog's soft fur. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending." The drive home was slow. His mind kept replaying the doctor's words, but it wasn't until he parked the car in his driveway that the reality of what he had to do truly hit him. He had to change. He had to want it. It wasn't just about physical therapy or following a diet plan. It was about something deeper, a shift in how he viewed himself. For too long, Frank had defined himself by what he'd lost: his wife, his youth, his vitality. He'd buried himself in the past, in memories of a time when he was the man who could take on the world. But the world had changed, and so had he. Frank realized that to move forward, he couldn't keep clinging to the past. He couldn't keep telling himself that his best days were behind him. He had to start living again. The next morning, Frank stared at his sneakers, the very same ones that had betrayed him on his fall the day before. They looked worn, faded, tired, just like he felt. He could almost hear them mocking him, reminding him that his stubbornness had led him here. But they were also a symbol, weren't they? They were the shoes he'd been comfortable in, the ones that had carried him through years of denial. They were a crutch, one he no longer needed. With a deep sigh, Frank slipped on a new pair of shoes he'd bought the day before. These weren't fancy. They were just a pair of supportive running shoes, nothing too flashy. But they felt different. They felt like the beginning of something new. "I'm doing this, Buddy," Frank muttered as he tied the laces, determination in his voice. The dog wagged his tail, as if in agreement, and Frank chuckled softly. Maybe he was crazy for thinking he could change everything at once. But he had to start somewhere. The first few days were difficult. Frank was sore, pain in places he didn't even know he had. His muscles, long neglected, screamed for relief, but he pushed through. Physical therapy wasn't easy, and neither was the change in his diet. But he kept going. Every morning, he laced up his new shoes and took Buddy for a walk, gradually increasing the distance. He started making healthier meals, tossing out the pre-packaged junk food and learning to cook again, even if it was just simple salads or grilled chicken. Sophia had called every day to check on him, her voice full of cautious optimism. At first, Frank didn't tell her about the pain, about how hard it was. He didn't want her to worry. But as the days went on, he began to notice small changes. His energy was up. He wasn't as winded after walking the dog. His wrist still ached, but it was less severe. He began to feel a faint sense of pride every time he made it through a workout or cooked a meal without resorting to fast food. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. One evening, after a long walk with Buddy, Frank stood in front of his bathroom mirror, taking a good, long look at himself. There were still lines on his face, the kind that came with years of hard living and heartache. His hair had thinned, and his body had aged in ways that weren't easy to ignore. But what stood before him was a man who had made a choice, a man who had taken the first step towards something better. Frank didn't know if he was going to be able to stick with this new lifestyle. But for the first time in years, he believed it was worth trying. Frank's legs ached as he stepped out onto the pavement for his morning walk. Buddy, ever the eager companion, trotted beside him, his tail wagging with a rhythm that almost seemed to encourage Frank to keep moving. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. This was the part Frank hated most. The early mornings, when the world was still asleep and the air was cool but not yet warm enough to feel welcoming. He wasn't sure what he expected, but this certainly wasn't it. The soreness in his legs, the tightness in his chest, he hadn't anticipated just how out of shape he was. His mind wandered back to the physical therapist's instructions from the day before. The therapist had warned him that this first week would be the hardest. "Your muscles are weak, Frank," she had said. "We're rebuilding your strength, but it won't happen overnight." He had nodded at the time, not fully understanding just how challenging it would be to push through the discomfort. "Just get through this one walk," Frank muttered to himself, eyes trained on the sidewalk in front of him. Just make it to the end of the street, and we'll see how you feel. Buddy, always patient, seemed to sense Frank's struggle. He slowed his pace and looked up at Frank with those soulful eyes, as if to say, "You can do it, old man." But the pain in Frank's legs and chest wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the voice in his head, the one that told him to stop, to go back to his comfortable routine of sitting on the couch and watching TV, to forget about the whole idea of getting fit altogether. It was easier to quit than to keep going. Easier to quit. Frank's foot hit a rock on the sidewalk, sending a jolt of pain up his leg. He stumbled, almost losing his balance. Buddy immediately darted forward, his leash pulling taut as he tried to steady his owner. Okay, Frank grunted, catching his breath. He straightened himself up and kept moving. One step. Then another. The nagging voice was louder now, pushing him to turn around and give up. But Frank fought back against it. No. Not today. It was a small victory, but Frank pushed on. He rounded the corner of his street and started heading toward the park, his feet feeling heavier with each step. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His heart raced in his chest. But through the discomfort, he couldn't help but feel a slight sense of accomplishment. By the time he reached the park, Buddy was happily trotting circles around him. Frank bent down to catch his breath, hands resting on his knees. His body was exhausted, every muscle protesting the effort, but he smiled. He'd made it. As he walked back toward his house, feeling the strain in his legs, Frank realized something. The hardest part wasn't the physical challenge, it was the mental battle. It wasn't the aches or the sweat, but the fight against his own mind, the urge to quit, to revert to the familiar. Later that day, as Frank sat on his couch nursing a cup of tea, he thought about how he had nearly given up that morning. It seemed like such a small thing, a morning walk, but for Frank, it felt like a major battle. And in a way, it was. He had fought against years of unhealthy habits, against a mindset that told him he was too old to change, too far gone. But now, as he sipped his tea, he realized something had shifted. He wasn't as out of breath as he thought he'd be. His legs were sore, yes, but they weren't completely wrecked. He hadn't failed, and that realization felt like a win. Then his phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Sophia. "Sophia, Dad, how's it going with the new routine?" Frank smiled at the message, feeling a pang of guilt. He had tried to hide the true difficulty of his journey from her, but now he couldn't lie. He typed back. "Frank, tough, but I made it through the walk today. It's a start." Sophia replied almost immediately. "Sophia, I'm proud of you, Dad. Keep going, okay? One step at a time. You've got this." Frank read her words and felt a surge of warmth. She had always been supportive, always been there for him even when he was too proud to ask for help. Maybe he wasn't doing this alone after all. As the day went on, Frank continued his routine, eating healthier, drinking more water, taking the occasional walk with Buddy. He had made a promise to himself, and he was determined to stick to it, no matter how difficult it became. But the next test came sooner than he expected. That afternoon, Frank had to run a quick errand. He had been putting it off for days, but he knew he needed a few supplies from the local grocery store. Buddy sat patiently in the car, waiting for his owner to return. As Frank walked toward the entrance of the store, he saw something that made his stomach drop, an elderly man walking out of the store, slowly but confidently, wearing shoes that looked like they had seen better days. Frank's first instinct was to look away, but something about the man's gait caught his attention. The man's shoes were clearly worn, and he was dragging one foot slightly as he walked. Frank paused. The old man was making it. He wasn't rushing, wasn't looking for shortcuts. He just kept moving, one step at a time. The moment struck Frank like a bolt of lightning. Here was a man, probably in his late 70s, showing more strength and resilience than Frank had in years. It was a sobering reminder of what could happen if he didn't take care of himself, if he didn't take charge of his health. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door of the store. He had a choice to make, and for the first time in a long time, he was beginning to believe he could make the right one. The days had started to blur together. Each morning, Frank laced up his sneakers and took Buddy for a walk, sticking to the same route he'd established in the park. He had even started doing light strength exercises in the living room after his walk. Squats, lunges, and a few stretches. It wasn't much, but it was something. Every time he finished, he felt a flicker of pride, like maybe he could actually do this. But the past week had been harder than the last. It wasn't the physical pain, though that was certainly there. His body had grown accustomed to the soreness that came with exercise, and he had learned to accept it as part of the process. No, what had changed was the mental toll. Frank found himself feeling more and more drained, not just from the workouts, but from the constant self-doubt that lingered in the back of his mind. Was he doing this for the right reasons? Was he doing it for himself, or because people expected him to? His thoughts raced as he sat down on his front steps after his morning walk, Buddy resting at his feet. The world was still quiet, and Frank found himself lost in a mix of frustration and fatigue. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Frank muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. It had been one of those mornings when every step felt like a battle. The simple act of getting out of bed had been a challenge, his legs stiff and reluctant. He had forced himself to keep going, but it was becoming harder to ignore the aching pain in his knees and back. Each movement felt like a struggle against his own body. Buddy nudged Frank's hand, his way of reminding him that, even though the walk was over, they still had each other. Frank scratched behind Buddy's ears, the dog's soft fur providing a moment of comfort. "You're the only one who believes in me, huh?" Frank said, his voice heavy with the weight of his doubts. Buddy gave a small whimper, his tail wagging lightly. "I just don't know," Frank continued. "What if I'm too old for this? What if my body's too far gone to change?" Later that morning, Frank made his way to his doctor's appointment with Dr. Mendez. His knees still felt stiff, and he limped slightly as he walked into the office. It had been 3 weeks since his last checkup, and Frank hadn't noticed much improvement. His clothes felt a little looser, but the progress seemed slower than he expected. "Hi, Frank," Dr. Mendez greeted him with a smile. "How have you been feeling since we last spoke?" Frank sat down across from her, staring down at his hands. He was hesitant to say much. He didn't want to admit that things hadn't been going as smoothly as he'd hoped. "I've been walking every day," Frank began, "and I've been doing the exercises you recommended. But I don't know. My knees still hurt, and sometimes my back feels like it's giving out. I just don't feel like I'm making the progress I should be." Dr. Mendez's expression softened as she listened. "It's normal for progress to feel slow, Frank. You're not going to go from zero to hero in just a few weeks, especially when your body's been inactive for as long as yours has. But we can adjust the plan to suit you better. Let's take a look at your range of motion and see where we need to go from here." As Dr. Mendez examined him, Frank's frustration grew. She had the tools, the knowledge, the solutions, but it felt like none of it was working for him. The pain in his knees was constant, like an old friend that refused to leave, and the idea of continuing on this path, without immediate results, felt overwhelming. "I'm trying, I really am," Frank said, voice strained. "But I don't think I can keep pushing through this pain. What if I'm doing more harm than good?" Dr. Mendez paused and looked Frank directly in the eye. "Frank, let me tell you something, it's not about doing it perfectly. It's about doing it consistently. Pain is a signal, yes, but some discomfort is also a part of rebuilding strength. If you're worried about causing damage, we can adjust your exercises to avoid further strain. But if you stop now, you'll never know what you could have achieved." Frank nodded slowly, though his mind was still clouded with doubt. The thought of continuing the routine felt exhausting. He was in his late 60s, and his body just wasn't the same as it used to be. The idea that he could somehow reverse the years of neglect felt like a cruel joke. But something in Dr. Mendez's words stuck with him. She didn't expect him to be perfect. She didn't expect him to suddenly run marathons. All she wanted was for him to keep going, one step at a time. Later that day, Frank decided to push through and complete his usual walk. He tried to clear his mind of the doubts that had been eating at him all day. The streets were quiet, the early evening air crisp, but every step felt like a battle against his own body. His knees ached. His back twinged. His lungs burned. But he kept walking. He kept moving. Buddy trotted beside him, seemingly unaware of the struggle that Frank was facing. The dog's carefree nature was a reminder that sometimes, it wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey. And Frank realized that maybe, just maybe, it was about taking small steps every day, even if they didn't feel like they were going anywhere. Even if the pain was still there, even if the progress felt slow, he had to keep moving forward. That evening, Frank sat down on his couch with a deep sigh. His muscles were sore, his body was tired, but something inside him had shifted. He hadn't quit. He had pushed through, even when every part of him screamed to stop. And that, he realized, was something worth celebrating. He took out his phone and sent a text to Sophia. "Frank, had a rough day, but I made it through. I'm not giving up. Just gotta keep going." Sophia replied almost immediately. "Sophia, I'm so proud of you, Dad. Every step counts. You're doing great. Keep it up." Frank smiled. It wasn't about the speed of progress. It was about the consistency, the will to keep going. He might not be where he wanted to be yet, but he was no longer the man he had been 3 weeks ago. He was a man who was learning how to keep moving forward. The morning was colder than usual, and the wind bit sharply at Frank's face as he walked down the familiar path of his morning routine. Buddy trotted alongside him, oblivious to the fact that this was supposed to be a good day. It had been 2 weeks since Frank's last doctor's visit, and for the most part, he had stuck to his plan. The walks were getting easier, and the pain in his knees wasn't as intense as it had been. But today, something felt different. Frank couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was running out of time. It had been a busy week. Work had piled up, phone calls had gone unanswered, and the pressure to stay on top of everything was starting to weigh on him. His routine, though it had become a small source of pride, felt more like a burden than a relief. Every day, it felt like there was something else demanding his attention. The walk, the exercises, the stretching, it was all becoming an obligation rather than a choice. As Frank looked down at Buddy, whose tail was wagging furiously at a passing squirrel, he sighed. "I don't know if I can keep this up, Buddy. Work's piling up, and I'm starting to feel like I'm falling behind." Buddy gave a soft bark, as if to say, "Don't give up now." Frank didn't reply. The truth was, he felt torn between his commitments to his health and his responsibilities. Every time he made time for his walk or his exercises, he felt like he was neglecting something else, whether it was an important phone call, an email he should have responded to, or just the basic things that came with maintaining a life that was, at the moment, a little chaotic. Later that day, Frank found himself sitting at his desk, his computer screen glowing in front of him. He had intended to take a break and head out for his afternoon walk, but the emails had piled up, and the urgent phone calls couldn't be ignored. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed by the decision in front of him. Take the walk. Get some fresh air. You'll feel better afterward. But the piles of work on his desk seemed to mock him, the ringing phone adding to the pressure. The guilt started creeping in. If he didn't take care of this now, he'd fall further behind. If he didn't respond to that email, the client might get upset. If he didn't take that phone call, it could derail the project. Ugh, Frank groaned, running a hand through his hair. He had to get this right. He couldn't afford to let his health get in the way of his job, could he? Frank ended up staying at his desk for another hour, sending a few emails and finishing a project that had been on his mind. But by the time he looked up, the day had slipped away from him. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the horizon. He hadn't moved from his desk. His back ached, his eyes were sore from staring at the screen, and his legs felt stiff. He hadn't taken a single step toward his physical well-being, and the guilt hit him hard. The phone rang again. It was Sophia. "Dad, how's it going?" she asked, her voice warm, as always. "Did you get your walk in today?" Frank hesitated, feeling the weight of his decision. "Not today, sweetheart. I had too much work to do, and by the time I finished, it was already too late. I'll get back on track tomorrow, though." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Dad, I know you're busy, but you have to take care of yourself too. You can't keep putting this off. Your health matters just as much as your work does." Frank closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew she was right. The truth was, he was terrified of falling behind in his career, of losing control of the things he'd worked so hard to build. But at what cost? Was he really doing himself any favors by ignoring his health? "You're right, Sophia," Frank said, his voice quieter than usual. I don't know how to balance it all." Sophia's voice softened. "Dad, you don't have to do it all at once. Take it one step at a time. If you need to adjust your schedule to fit in your health, do it. You can't pour from an empty cup, remember?" Frank smiled slightly at her words. "I'll try. Thanks for reminding me." The conversation with Sophia lingered in Frank's mind long after the call ended. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore, his health was at risk. The pain in his knees wasn't just physical, it was a warning. His body was telling him he needed to make a change, but he couldn't keep putting that change on the back burner for work, for deadlines, or for anything else. The next day, Frank decided to take action. He didn't wait until the afternoon or let work pile up. Instead, he set a timer on his phone, an hour, no more. He promised himself he would focus on his health first, even if it meant letting some other things wait. The walk was difficult. His legs felt heavy, and the sun was hotter than he had expected. But he kept moving, pushing through the discomfort. For the first time in days, Frank wasn't thinking about emails or meetings. He wasn't thinking about deadlines or calls. All he thought about was the steady rhythm of his feet against the pavement and the reassuring presence of Buddy beside him. He didn't finish his walk with a sense of triumph or pride, but with a quiet understanding, he had made a choice. For once, he chose his health over everything else. That evening, as Frank sat down to dinner, he felt different. He wasn't as physically tired as he had been in the past few days. He wasn't feeling drained or overwhelmed by his to-do list. He felt balanced, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The phone rang again. It was Sophia. "Dad, how was the walk today?" Frank smiled, a real smile this time. "It was tough, but I made it. And I'm going to keep making it, no matter what." Sophia's voice was full of warmth and pride. "That's what I like to hear, Dad. You're doing great. Just keep taking it one day at a time." The morning after Frank's decision to prioritize his health, he felt a small sense of accomplishment as he woke up. The pain in his knees was still there, but it was more manageable than it had been. He got up early, eager to keep his routine going, but as he stepped into the kitchen, he was greeted by a stack of unopened mail and a blinking voicemail on his phone. For a moment, Frank stood there, staring at the mess of responsibilities that awaited him. It was as if the world had conspired to remind him of everything he needed to do. "Don't do it," he muttered to himself. "Stay focused." Buddy bounded into the kitchen, tail wagging as if to say, "You're ready for today, aren't you?" Frank chuckled and knelt down to scratch Buddy behind the ears. "You're right. I've got to get this walk in first." But as he grabbed his jacket, his phone rang. It was his office, a call from his colleague, Sarah. Frank, Sarah's voice was strained, we've got a serious situation on the project. We need your input now. Frank froze. The call had come at the worst possible time. He was committed to the walk, he knew it was important, but this project was one he'd been working on for months. He couldn't afford to let it slip through his fingers. I'll be right there, Frank said, pushing aside his intentions. He grabbed the mail and the phone and quickly dialed into the call. As the conversation unfolded, the work seemed to pile on him even more. There were problems with the client's design, last-minute changes, and a looming deadline that he couldn't ignore. His heart raced as he listened, his mind pulled in multiple directions. The conversation seemed to go on forever, each minute stretching into an eternity. In the back of his mind, he kept thinking about the walk, about what he needed to do for himself. But the weight of work was undeniable. He hung up the phone and stared at the clock. His walk would have to wait. By the time Frank wrapped up the work-related calls, it was already late afternoon. He hadn't moved from the kitchen counter. His body felt stiff from sitting too long, his mind exhausted from the constant stress. He had missed his window for the walk, and now, as the sun began to set, he was left with nothing but the feeling of regret. Buddy stood by the door, looking up at Frank with those big, hopeful eyes. The dog didn't understand why the walk hadn't happened. To Buddy, there was no excuse, just the need to get outside and run, to feel the wind against his fur. Frank knelt down again, feeling a wave of guilt wash over him. I'm sorry, Buddy. I didn't keep my promise today. The dog let out a soft bark, as if forgiving him. But Frank wasn't sure he could forgive himself. He had let work take precedence again. The same thing that had gotten him into this situation in the first place. The next morning, Frank woke up later than usual. The exhaustion from yesterday had drained him, and as he rolled out of bed, his knees screamed in protest. He could already feel the weight of the day ahead of him. Meetings. Emails. More phone calls. But this time, something inside him shifted. He couldn't keep putting his health on hold. Not anymore. The sun was still low in the sky, the air crisp and fresh. Frank laced up his sneakers, grabbed Buddy's leash, and stepped outside. This time, nothing was going to stop him. The walk was slower than it had been before. Every step was a reminder of how much his body had changed, of how far he had to go. But with each stride, the weight on his shoulders seemed to lessen, and the guilt that had plagued him the day before began to fade. He was doing something for himself, and that was enough. By the time they reached the park, Frank felt a small sense of victory. It wasn't about going fast or pushing his limits. It was simply about showing up, about committing to something that mattered, no matter how small it seemed. When Frank returned home, he felt better, not just physically, but mentally. The anxiety of the past few days still lingered, but it wasn't overwhelming anymore. He had taken control of his routine, even if it was just one small walk. That was a step in the right direction. But just as he was starting to relax, his phone buzzed again. It was another message from Sarah. Sarah, Frank, we need a decision on the budget. I know you're busy, but this can't wait. Frank groaned. He didn't have time for this. But then he paused. He took a deep breath and thought about what Sophia had said. You can't pour from an empty cup. He picked up the phone, hit reply, and typed out a simple message. Frank, I'm stepping away for a bit. I'll be back in an hour to handle the budget. Please give me some space to focus on it. He hit send. For the first time in a while, Frank wasn't letting the work consume him. He needed to make sure he was okay before he could help anyone else. It was hard, but it was a necessary decision. An hour later, after taking some time to clear his head, Frank returned to his work. The decision felt right. Even though the pressure was still there, he wasn't as weighed down by it. He had taken the time to focus on his physical health, and now, he could dive back into his responsibilities with a clearer mind. Later that evening, as he sat down with Buddy on the couch, Frank reflected on the choices he had made. He had made progress, small, but meaningful progress. He wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would still be filled with obstacles, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. And that meant something. He pulled out his phone and texted Sophia again. "Frank, had a good walk today. Took a break from work, too. It felt necessary. Thanks for the reminder." Sophia responded almost immediately. "Sophia, that's great, Dad. You're doing amazing. Keep it up. We're all proud of you." Frank smiled and put the phone down. For the first time in a while, he wasn't consumed by his responsibilities. He had found a balance between taking care of himself and doing the things that mattered. And that, he realized, was the key to making lasting change. Frank had been walking every morning for the past few days now. It wasn't easy, his knees still ached, and sometimes, his energy seemed to fail him, but there was a new sense of determination behind his steps. Buddy had been his faithful companion, and together, they had walked through the neighborhood, through the park, even along the outskirts of the city, where the roads were quieter, the air fresher. But that morning, as he stretched his legs in preparation, he felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something was wrong. The calm that had come with his routine was now being overshadowed by an unfamiliar tension. Buddy, who had been eagerly bouncing at the door, stopped in his tracks and turned to look up at Frank, his head tilted as if sensing something Frank couldn't quite articulate. "What's wrong, boy?" Frank murmured, rubbing his dog's head absent-mindedly. His mind was racing. It had been a week since Frank had set clear boundaries with his work, and he'd kept his word, sort of. He'd been sticking to his morning walks and trying to prioritize his health. But that morning, a small voice in the back of his mind kept whispering, "What if you can't keep this up?" It was a thought he hadn't let himself entertain for the past few days. He'd made a commitment to himself, and he was determined to stick with it. But the idea of change, of truly committing to a new lifestyle, felt like a huge, daunting leap. What if it didn't stick? What if the pain came back? What if, despite his best efforts, he couldn't push through? The self-doubt crept in slowly, like a shadow growing longer with the setting sun. The morning was crisp, but the air felt heavier. Frank shook his head. He couldn't let his fears hold him back, not again. But there it was, the fear of change, standing in front of him like a wall. As he stepped outside, he told himself it was just the weight of the day ahead, another round of stressful meetings, calls, and deadlines. But as he walked, the nagging feeling didn't go away. His feet felt heavier, and the pain in his knees began to intensify, a reminder of the physical limitations that still existed. It wasn't that Frank didn't want to walk. He knew the importance of staying active, of improving his health. But the fear was real. What if he couldn't change? What if his body, which had been giving him trouble for years, just wasn't capable of handling this new routine? As they made their way down the familiar path, Buddy's tail wagging in front of him, Frank tried to push these thoughts away. He needed to stay positive, he reminded himself. He needed to stay focused. But what if staying focused wasn't enough? Frank had always prided himself on his ability to adapt. He'd made countless career changes, worked in different industries, met new people, and found success. Change had never been a foreign concept, he had embraced it in many ways. But this felt different. His health was not something that could be controlled by just willpower alone. He couldn't fake it, couldn't ignore the signs his body was sending him. What if, after all this effort, he still couldn't get better? What if he never felt truly healthy again? The thoughts consumed him as he made his way through the park, Buddy trailing behind. Frank's pace slowed, his mind racing, and his breath became uneven. His heart wasn't in the walk anymore. The doubts were too loud. The fear of failure, of never being enough, of trying and not succeeding, overwhelmed him. Buddy tugged at the leash, pulling Frank toward a bench. Frank sat down with a heavy sigh, rubbing his knees. The day felt impossibly long, and the future even longer. He stared down at the pavement, lost in thought. "You're okay, Frank," he muttered to himself. "You're okay." But the words didn't sound convincing. There were so many unknowns in front of him. Could he really keep up with this new routine? What if he hit a roadblock again? What if the progress he had made so far was just an illusion? Buddy rested his head on Frank's lap, as if trying to comfort him. Frank ran his fingers through the dog's fur, his thoughts still racing. Later that afternoon, Frank received a call from his doctor. He had been dreading it. He knew he had a follow-up appointment coming up, but he didn't want to hear the words he was afraid of. "You need to be more consistent, your progress isn't as good as we hoped, there's only so much we can do," the phrases played out in his mind like an endless loop. "Mr. Blake," the voice on the other end of the line said, "we've reviewed your results, and I'd like to go over a few things with you. Are you available for a consultation tomorrow?" Frank's stomach dropped. The last thing he wanted right now was to hear bad news. But he couldn't avoid it. "Sure, I'll be there," Frank said, his voice betraying a slight tremor. He couldn't even pretend to be confident. After the call ended, Frank slumped back in his chair, staring at the wall. The fear he had been pushing aside flooded back in full force. What if the doctor told him he couldn't do it? What if his efforts hadn't been enough? He ran a hand over his face. He couldn't think like that. He couldn't let fear take over. The next morning, Frank showed up at the doctor's office, his heart racing. As he sat in the waiting room, his mind ran through every worst-case scenario he could think of. The words of Sophia echoed in his mind, "You can't pour from an empty cup." But what if the cup wasn't just empty, it was broken? "Mr. Blake?" The nurse's voice snapped Frank out of his thoughts. He stood up, his legs feeling weak beneath him. They led him into the consultation room, and after a few minutes, Dr. Patel came in, his expression calm but professional. "Good morning, Frank. How are you feeling?" Dr. Patel asked, sitting down across from him. "I'm okay," Frank replied, his voice tight. "I've been walking like you said, but I don't know if it's working. I'm still not feeling great." Dr. Patel smiled reassuringly. "Well, let's take a look at the progress you've made." After reviewing his results, Dr. Patel leaned forward. "Your mobility has improved. Not drastically, but enough to show that your body is responding. You've made progress, Frank, and that's what matters. It might not be fast, but it's there." Frank exhaled, relief flooding him. The fear of failure, of being told he was stuck in a perpetual cycle of pain and frustration, lifted. "You're doing better than you think," Dr. Patel continued. "Keep going. I know it's tough, but every step you take is a step in the right direction." Frank nodded slowly, a smile breaking through his worries. "I can do this. I will keep going." As he left the office, Frank felt lighter. The fear that had clung to him for so long didn't vanish entirely, but it wasn't as loud. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he wasn't facing them alone. He had made progress, and he could keep making progress, one step at a time. And that, he realized, was enough. The phone buzzed on Frank's desk just as he was sitting down with a cup of coffee. It was an alert from his calendar, reminding him of the big meeting he had scheduled with his team. But the message was accompanied by a second notification, reminder, doctor's appointment in 2 days. Frank's heart gave a small jolt. It wasn't that he was afraid of the checkup, but he was becoming increasingly anxious about his progress. The more he worked on improving his health, the more he wondered if he could keep it up. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the meeting ahead. It was a crucial discussion about an upcoming project, and he couldn't afford to let his mind wander. But the distraction of his health was always there, lurking in the background, especially now that he was starting to feel the tension in his knees again. The more he pushed himself, the more it seemed to fight back. The morning passed quickly, filled with emails and calls. Frank found himself growing increasingly tense as he tried to juggle everything. His knee was aching again, and his back was starting to stiffen as he sat hunched over his desk for hours. He had tried to stick to his routine, but the pain was making it harder and harder to keep up with his walking schedule. By the time the meeting came, Frank's mind was scattered. He could barely focus on the conversation, his thoughts constantly drifting back to his body's protest against his new lifestyle. How much longer could he keep this up? After the meeting, Frank decided to step outside for some fresh air. His body was screaming for rest, but he didn't want to lose the momentum he had built. He needed to get his walk in, he told himself. It was a non-negotiable part of his routine now. Buddy, of course, was ready to go, tail wagging, completely unaware of the internal conflict Frank was facing. As they walked down the street, Frank tried to push through the pain, but every step was a reminder of just how far he still had to go. He grimaced with each step, the ache in his knee radiating up into his thigh. By the time they reached the park, Frank was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The familiar sense of dread was creeping back in, the one he had felt during his earlier doubts. What if this was as good as it got? What if he never felt truly healthy again? Sitting on a park bench, Buddy resting by his side, Frank tried to catch his breath. The cold wind whipped around him, but it did nothing to cool the fire of frustration building inside. His body had betrayed him again. For all the effort he had put in, for all the good days, the reality was that change wasn't going to come easily. The pain wasn't going to go away just because he wanted it to. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, a familiar voice interrupted his self-doubt. "Hey, Frank. Good to see you out here." Frank looked up to see Sophia approaching, her bright smile instantly lifting his spirits. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that he wasn't doing this alone. "Hey, Sophia," Frank said, trying to muster a smile. "Just needed a breather. Things haven't been going exactly as planned today." Sophia sat down next to him on the bench, looking at him with understanding. "I get it. It's tough sometimes. You're doing great, though. Don't be so hard on yourself." Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Sophia. I thought I could do this. I thought I could push through the pain, but it just doesn't seem to get any better." Sophia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've made incredible progress already. It's okay to have tough days. Don't let them define you. You're still moving forward, even when it feels like you're stuck. Every step you take is a victory." "I don't know. Some days, it just feels like I'm back at square one," Frank admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. Sophia gave him a knowing look. "That's the thing about progress. It's not linear. Some days will be harder than others. But that doesn't mean you've failed. It just means you're human." Frank thought about her words for a moment. She was right. It was easy to fall into the trap of thinking that one setback meant failure. But maybe he needed to see the bigger picture, to remember all the small wins that had led him to this point. The rest of the walk was quieter, Frank's mind somewhat clearer. Sophia's words had grounded him, and though his body still protested, he was no longer consumed by the fear of failure. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep going, even on the bad days. Later that evening, Frank sat down to assess his progress. He had kept up with his routine for the most part, but the pain in his knee was a constant reminder that he wasn't out of the woods yet. It was frustrating, but it wasn't the end of the road. It was just another challenge to overcome. He pulled out his phone and texted Sophia. "Frank, I don't know if I'm doing this right, but thanks for the reminder. I'll keep pushing forward. Even when it feels like I'm stuck." Sophia's reply came almost immediately. "Sophia, you're doing amazing. I'm proud of you. One day at a time." That night, Frank felt a little lighter. The weight of his doubt hadn't disappeared completely, but he was learning to live with it. He couldn't control everything, but he could control his response. And that, he realized, was the key to moving forward. The following morning, Frank woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. His knee still hurt, but he was determined to continue his journey. The fear and frustration hadn't gone away, but now he had the tools to face them head-on. He couldn't let one setback derail everything he had worked for. After all, it wasn't about being perfect, it was about being persistent. He grabbed his sneakers and leashed Buddy, ready to face the day. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one challenge you've overcome that you never thought you could? The day started like any other. Frank had his morning coffee, Buddy was at his feet, waiting for their daily walk, and the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon. He was feeling better, more energized than he had in days, and the stiffness in his knee had lessened, just as he had hoped. But even as he laced up his sneakers and prepared to head out, a familiar and unwelcome feeling crept into his mind. It was the same feeling he had experienced during his years of struggle, an overwhelming urge to let go, to give in to the convenience of staying inside, to skip just one more walk. It wasn't that he didn't want to continue. It was just that, in the back of his mind, a part of him wondered if it was worth it. I can just skip today, right? He asked himself, looking at Buddy, who was wagging his tail in anticipation. Just one day off won't hurt. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, Frank felt a pang of guilt. He had been through too much already, fought through too much pain, to let this be the day he gave up. He knew that skipping today could lead to skipping tomorrow, and then the day after that. But there was another temptation. One that, for some reason, always seemed to crop up on the mornings when he felt vulnerable. The temptation came in the form of his old friend, Jack. Jack had been a part of Frank's life for years. They'd been close since their college days, and even though they didn't see each other as often anymore, their bond was still strong. Jack was the kind of guy who lived for good times, long nights of laughter, good food, and plenty of indulgence. Jack never seemed to worry about his health, and for a long time, neither did Frank. They had shared countless meals and drinks together, never worrying about the consequences. That morning, Frank received a text from Jack. Jack, hey, Frank. Long time no see. I'm in town this afternoon. Let's grab some lunch and catch up. I know a great new place that has the best burgers in town. What do you say? Frank stared at the message for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. It was tempting. Really tempting. The thought of a good meal with an old friend made him feel nostalgic, like a part of his old life was calling him back. A part of him wanted to say yes, to forget about the healthy routine he'd been trying to stick to and enjoy the familiar indulgence of food, fun, and laughter. But there was the other part of him, the part that was starting to feel different, that was beginning to appreciate the small victories in his journey. He had made a commitment to himself, and he knew that one slip-up could lead to another. A burger with Jack wasn't just a burger, it was a step back into old habits, a reminder of the life he was trying to leave behind. Frank put the phone down and stepped into the living room, pacing. Buddy followed him, sensing his distress. Frank scratched the dog's ears absent-mindedly as he weighed his options. He had been doing so well. He didn't want to let this temptation derail all the progress he had made. But it was Jack. He hadn't seen him in months. And it was a burger. Just one. Frank's mind raced, and the inner conflict made his head spin. He didn't want to disappoint himself, but he didn't want to let his friend down either. Was this really a test of his willpower, or just an opportunity to reconnect with someone who had been important to him for so long? As he stood there, the decision became clearer. I can't, Frank said, more to himself than to anyone else. I can't let this be the thing that pulls me off track. I've worked too hard. He grabbed his phone and typed a message to Jack. Frank, hey, Jack. It's great to hear from you. I'd love to catch up, but I'm really focused on staying on track with my health right now. Maybe we can grab coffee sometime soon. Let me know. Frank hit send, his heart pounding. It was the right decision, he knew that. But there was still a part of him that felt conflicted. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the old version of himself that he was trying to leave behind. A version of himself that had been too willing to give in to instant gratification, to forget the long-term consequences of his actions. But today, Frank was choosing differently. He was choosing his health, his future, over the fleeting comfort of old habits. Later that afternoon, after his walk and a healthy lunch, Frank sat down at his desk and opened his email. He glanced at the clock, 2 p.m., and smiled as he thought about the decision he had made. It hadn't been easy, but it had been the right one. The temptation had been strong, but his resolve was stronger. He felt a small sense of pride, knowing that he had turned down the temptation and stuck with his plan. He didn't need the burger, and he didn't need to fall back into old routines. As the week passed, Frank noticed something important. He felt better. Physically, mentally, and emotionally. By turning down the temptation, he had proven to himself that he could keep going. The small victories were adding up. But Jack's message had sparked something else too, something Frank hadn't expected. It reminded him that his journey wasn't just about food and exercise. It was about the choices he made every day, the people he allowed into his life, and the values he was living by. It was about learning to say no to things that didn't align with his new path, even when they were wrapped up in nostalgia and comfort. Later that evening, Frank received a call from Sophia, checking in as usual. "How's it going today, Dad?" she asked, her voice bright and full of energy. "I turned down lunch with Jack today," Frank said, a bit of a surprised laugh escaping him. "It wasn't easy, but I did it." Sophia laughed. "I'm so proud of you. I know it wasn't an easy decision, but it's the right one. You've come so far." Frank smiled. "Thanks, sweetie. I'm starting to believe that myself." The morning was unusually cold, the kind of chill that crept through Frank's jacket and into his bones. As he sat down with his cup of coffee, the weight of the past few days seemed to sit heavily on his shoulders. Despite the wins, his consistent walks, his refusal to give in to old temptations, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his daughter, Sophia. "Sophia, Dad, can you call me when you get a chance? There's something I need to talk to you about." The text hit Frank harder than he expected. Sophia rarely asked for serious conversations like this. His mind immediately raced through 100 different scenarios. Was everything okay with her job? Was she having problems with her friends or her health? Was she in some kind of trouble? Taking a deep breath, Frank dialed her number, trying to push aside the flood of anxious thoughts. He didn't want to assume the worst, but it was hard not to. When Sophia picked up, Frank could hear the tension in her voice. "Hey, Dad," she said, her tone lighter than usual, but still laced with a sense of unease. "I need to talk to you about something, it's important." Frank's stomach tightened. "What's going on, Sophia? Is everything okay?" Sophia hesitated for a moment. "It's just. I've been feeling a little overwhelmed lately, and I'm really struggling to manage everything. Work's been really stressful, and I feel like I'm not doing enough. I just needed to get it off my chest. I don't know if I'm handling things the way I should." Frank's heart sank. He could feel the weight of her words, the burden she was carrying. As much as he wanted to help, he didn't know what to say. This wasn't something he could fix with a few encouraging words. It was clear that she was under more pressure than she had let on before. He tried to sound reassuring. "Sophia, you're doing the best you can. Life's tough sometimes, and it's okay to feel like you're struggling. You've made it through so much already. Just remember you don't have to do it all alone. I'm always here for you." Sophia's voice cracked slightly. "I know, Dad. I just feel like I should have it all together by now. You know." Frank felt a sharp pang in his chest. He recognized that feeling, he had felt it himself too many times to count. The pressure to keep pushing, to keep going even when everything felt too heavy. It was part of why he had started this journey in the first place, to prove to himself that he could keep going, no matter what life threw at him. But now, he was hearing it from his daughter. And it hurt. "I get it," Frank said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I really do. But remember that no one's perfect. Not me, not you. We all have our moments of doubt. What matters is that we keep going, one step at a time. Even when it feels like we're stuck." Sophia paused, then spoke again, a little more steady. "Thanks, Dad. I just needed to hear that. I'll figure it out. I know it's just a rough patch. But I'll be okay. I'm here if you need anything, Sophia," Frank reassured her, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. At least she had heard him, and maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize she didn't have to carry everything alone. As the conversation ended, Frank sat still for a moment, the weight of the exchange lingering in the air. It wasn't the kind of conversation he had wanted to have, but in many ways, it was the one he needed to hear. Life wasn't about being perfect, it was about accepting the tough moments and pushing forward despite them. The rest of the day went by in a blur. Frank had planned to get some work done, but the conversation with Sophia weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about her struggles, about how she was trying to keep everything together while silently battling the stress. It was hard not to see the parallels between her struggles and his own. Just like he was fighting through physical pain and setbacks, Sophia was grappling with her own emotional battles. The thought hit Frank like a brick. He had been so focused on his own journey, his health, his routines, his progress, that he had momentarily forgotten that emotional health was just as important as physical health. He had been learning how to take care of his body, but now he needed to learn how to truly support his daughter. Later that evening, Frank went for his usual walk with Buddy, but his mind wasn't on the exercise. His legs moved through the familiar motions, but his thoughts were far away, swirling with the weight of the conversation. He didn't know how to fix everything for Sophia, but he knew one thing for sure: he needed to be there for her, not just as a father, but as a listener, as someone who understood the importance of taking things one step at a time. As they rounded the block, Frank's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Sophia. "Sophia, I just wanted to say thanks again, Dad. I really appreciate your support. I'm going to take it one day at a time, just like you said. I'll be all right." Frank smiled softly at the message, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. It was the first step, but it was a step in the right direction. She was learning what he had learned on his journey, that you don't have to have everything figured out all at once. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep going, and eventually, things would start to fall into place. Later that night, as Frank prepared for bed, he reflected on everything he had learned over the past few months. His physical journey was far from over, and there would be more days of struggle ahead. But his emotional growth, too, was part of this process. He wasn't just learning how to take care of his body. He was learning how to deal with the things that had held him back for so long: his doubts, his insecurities, his emotional barriers. He was learning how to be present for the people he loved, even when life got tough. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across Frank's living room. He had just finished his walk with Buddy, but something felt different this time. There was an unsettled feeling in his chest, a tightness that he couldn't shake. He had been making progress, his knee felt better, his energy was up, and his diet was more consistent than ever. Yet, in the midst of these victories, a familiar feeling had started to creep back in: the fear of failure. It had always been there, lurking in the background of his life, silently influencing his decisions and actions. The fear that no matter how hard he tried, he'd never be able to fully overcome his obstacles. The fear that his efforts, no matter how much he put into them, would ultimately fall short. Frank sat down on the couch, running a hand through his hair. The fear was irrational, he knew that. After all, he had made it this far. He had already beaten so many odds just to get here. But even with all the progress he had made, he couldn't help but wonder, what if it's not enough? What if I can't keep going? He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push the thoughts away. But they kept coming, relentless and loud. His mind wandered back to the time when everything had fallen apart. To the years of trying and failing, of starting a fitness plan only to give up a few weeks later, of dieting only to binge when the stress became too much. It had happened so many times, it felt like a cycle that was destined to repeat itself. The fear of failure had been a constant companion, sitting quietly in the back of his mind, ready to sabotage any progress he made. He would set goals, dream big, and then, when things didn't go perfectly, the fear would emerge, convincing him to quit. Frank knew that this fear wasn't just about his physical health. It was about his entire life. It was about believing that he wasn't worthy of the success he desired. It was about not trusting himself enough to follow through, even when he knew what needed to be done. But this time was different. He could feel it. As he sat there, grappling with his emotions, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his old friend, Jack, the same Jack who had invited him for lunch in Chapter 11. Jack was checking in, and his text felt like a reminder of everything Frank had once tried to leave behind. Jack, hey, Frank. I've been thinking about our last conversation. You still up for a hangout? I miss the old times. I know things have changed, but we could have a drink and catch up. What do you say? Frank stared at the message, his mind racing. He had worked so hard to get to this point. He was finally finding his rhythm, his new lifestyle, and the progress he was making. But here it was again, an invitation to fall back into the old habits, to surrender to the comfort of the past, to take a step backward. His finger hovered over the screen, uncertain. The old Frank would have jumped at the chance. The old Frank would have said yes, telling himself that just one night wouldn't hurt. But this new Frank, the one who had worked so hard to turn things around, the one who was finally starting to believe in his own strength. He couldn't afford to go backward. Frank put the phone down and stood up, pacing around the living room. He couldn't ignore the anxiety building inside him. He knew the temptation would always be there, these moments of uncertainty, these old friends and habits, pulling at him. They were the echoes of his past, and he couldn't allow them to dictate his future. For the first time in a long time, Frank found himself wrestling with something more than physical effort. This was emotional work, mental work, and the hardest kind of change, the kind that required him to confront his own self-doubt. He sat back down, took a deep breath, and thought back to everything he had learned so far. I've come this far, he thought. I've already made so many changes. This is just another step, another moment to prove to myself that I can do it. The old Frank is gone. The new one is here to stay. Frank typed out a response to Jack, the words coming slowly, but with certainty. Frank, hey, Jack. I really appreciate you reaching out, but I'm going to have to pass this time. I'm focused on making some changes in my life right now, and I need to stay committed to them. Let's catch up another time, though. Take care. He hit send and felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't easy to turn down the invitation. The temptation to reconnect with his past was strong. But Frank knew that saying no was the right choice. He wasn't just rejecting an old friend or an old habit, he was rejecting the fear that told him he couldn't change. He was rejecting the voice that tried to convince him he wasn't capable of sticking with it. Later that evening, Frank went for a quiet walk, Buddy trotting alongside him. The walk was peaceful, but Frank's mind was still spinning. The fear wasn't gone, it never truly disappeared, but something had shifted. Each step he took felt like a small victory over that fear. With every step, Frank realized that overcoming his fear wasn't about eliminating it, it was about moving forward in spite of it. It was about choosing to trust himself, choosing to keep going even when the path wasn't clear, and knowing that failure wasn't the end, it was just part of the journey. As he walked back home, Frank felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. He wasn't afraid of failure anymore. He had learned that failure wasn't the enemy. The true enemy was giving up, the decision to quit when things got hard. And Frank wasn't going to quit. He was going to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The weather had changed overnight. What was once a sunny spring morning had transformed into a gray, overcast afternoon. Frank stood at the window, watching the rain begin to fall in soft sheets, as if the sky itself was reflecting his mood. He had just returned from a routine physical therapy session for his knee, and the news wasn't what he had hoped for. His therapist, Dr. Susan, had advised him to scale back his walking for the next few weeks. He had pushed too hard, too fast, and now his knee was showing signs of wear. It wasn't a major injury, but it was enough to halt his progress. "It's important to listen to your body, Frank," Dr. Susan had said. "You've made great strides, but if you push too hard, you risk undoing all the work you've done. Take it easy for a while, and let your knee recover." Frank had left the office feeling deflated, a familiar feeling creeping in. He had been doing so well, walking consistently, feeling stronger every day. But now, the sudden setback left him questioning everything. Was this the beginning of another failure? Was this how it always ended, right when he thought he had things under control? As he paced around his living room, Frank's thoughts began to spiral. He had come so far. He had fought his way through every obstacle, one step at a time, only to be told that he couldn't push any further. He could feel the old voice of doubt rising within him, the voice that told him that maybe he wasn't cut out for this after all. Maybe he wasn't strong enough to keep going. Buddy, his loyal golden retriever, came trotting over to Frank, sensing his unease. Frank leaned down, giving Buddy a scratch behind the ears, grateful for the comforting presence. But even Buddy couldn't shake the feelings of frustration and doubt that gnawed at Frank. "I don't know what to do, boy," Frank muttered. "I've worked so hard. I thought I was past all this. Why now? Why does this keep happening?" Buddy simply wagged his tail, as if to say, "We keep going, one step at a time." It was a reminder that no matter what, Frank wasn't alone in this. He had his support system, Buddy, Sophia, and even the small but significant progress he had made. And that had to count for something, didn't it? It took Frank most of the evening to calm his mind. He didn't want to admit it, but the disappointment was deep. He had been looking forward to the next milestone, to the point where he could proudly say that his physical health had improved dramatically. But now, that progress was on hold. Still, as the night wore on, Frank realized something. This setback wasn't the end of his journey, it was just a detour. There would always be setbacks, big and small. What mattered wasn't how fast he went, but whether or not he kept going. If he gave up now, he would lose everything he had worked for. He could either sit in frustration and let the setback define him, or he could adjust, pivot, and move forward with a new plan. He'd done it before. The last time he thought he couldn't go any further, he had found a way. He could do it again. The next morning, Frank woke up early, determined to adjust his focus. He couldn't walk as much as he wanted to, but there were other things he could do. He could focus on strengthening his upper body, improve his core, and maybe even take up swimming, something less stressful on his knee but still a great full-body workout. He headed to his home gym, which had become his sanctuary during this journey. The weights, the treadmill, the yoga mat, it was all there, waiting for him. Frank's usual routine had been centered around walking, but now he would need to shift his attention. As he went through his workout, he focused on form, strength, and consistency. He didn't let the frustration overwhelm him. Instead, he embraced the challenge. He'd spent so much time focusing on progress in one area that he had forgotten how much potential there was in others. His knee might be sidelined for a bit, but that didn't mean his entire journey was on hold. By the end of the week, Frank was feeling better about the situation. His knee was still tender, but he was finding ways to stay active that didn't cause any pain. The workout was becoming a bit more varied, and in a way, he felt like this change had reignited his sense of purpose. He wasn't just doing the same old thing over and over again. He was learning to adapt. Still, the emotional toll wasn't easy to shake. There were moments when Frank would feel the sting of disappointment, when the voice of doubt would creep back in. But each time, he reminded himself that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just a bump in the road. He had faced setbacks before, he had lost weight, then gained it back, then lost it again. He had failed time and time again, but he always came back stronger. One evening, after a particularly tough day, Frank sat down with his journal, as he often did when he needed to sort out his thoughts. He wrote, "This week was hard. The setback was frustrating, and there were times when I thought about giving up. But I didn't. I've learned that setbacks aren't failures, they're just pauses, moments that allow me to breathe, recalibrate, and keep going. I'm not perfect, and I don't need to be. I just need to keep trying. One day at a time, one step at a time." He closed the journal, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him the days prior. He wasn't where he wanted to be just yet, but he was on the right path. And that was enough for now. The week had been a blur. Between adjusting his routine and trying to stay positive despite the limitations on his knee, Frank hadn't had much time to reflect on how he was truly feeling. He had been moving forward with determination, focusing on the physical aspect of his health, but the mental and emotional weight of the past had quietly begun to resurface. It happened unexpectedly. One evening, while scrolling through old photos on his phone, Frank stumbled across an image of his family. It was an old picture, taken years ago during a vacation at the lake house. He was smiling, a rare but genuine moment, surrounded by his parents and sister. His mother's warm smile was frozen in time, her eyes full of hope and love, while his father stood beside her, his strong arms around both Frank and his sister. That was before everything changed. Frank's gaze lingered on the photo, and for the first time in months, he felt a sharp pang of loss. His mother had passed away when he was still in his 20s, a battle with illness that had taken her far too soon. His father, who had been a rock for their family, had gone quiet after her death, retreating into himself in a way that Frank hadn't fully understood at the time. And then, there was his sister, who had distanced herself emotionally, unable to cope with the loss in her own way. It had been hard. So much of his youth had been spent in the shadow of that grief. He had tried to be strong, to keep things together, but it had been a struggle. And somewhere along the way, he had started to believe that maybe he wasn't enough. That maybe, deep down, he didn't deserve happiness or success, because he had never fully processed the loss. Instead, he had buried the pain and kept going. As Frank stared at the photo, the grief he had buried so deeply began to bubble to the surface. His breath caught in his chest, and he could feel the familiar knot of sadness tightening in his throat. He didn't want to feel this. Not now. Not when things were finally starting to improve. But the truth was, he had never fully dealt with his past. It was always there, lurking in the background, influencing his decisions, his fears, his self-doubt. He had worked so hard to rebuild his body, but in many ways, he had ignored his emotional health. The pain from losing his mother, the strain in his relationship with his father, and the loneliness that had followed, those were the things he hadn't truly faced. And now, it was clear, he couldn't move forward completely until he confronted them. That night, Frank didn't sleep much. His mind raced with memories and emotions that he had tried so hard to ignore. The thought of his mother, her laughter, the way she had always encouraged him to follow his dreams, haunted him. The way his father had withdrawn after her death, leaving Frank to fend for himself emotionally, it was as if he had lost both of his parents at once, even though they were still alive. Frank didn't want to feel this way. He didn't want to acknowledge how deeply the past had affected him. But as the night stretched on, he realized that this wasn't just a setback, it was an opportunity. An opportunity to face the emotional scars that had been keeping him stuck for so long. The next morning, Frank sat down at his kitchen table, feeling drained but also determined. He needed to process this, to finally give himself permission to grieve and heal. It wasn't just about his knee, his fitness, or his weight anymore. It was about confronting the parts of himself he had hidden away for years. Sophia called him in the afternoon, a simple check-in, but it was just the conversation Frank needed. "Hey, how's the knee?" she asked, her voice warm and concerned. "I'm getting through it," Frank replied. "It's tough, but I'll adjust. I've been focusing on other parts of my routine." "You're strong, Frank. You've been doing amazing," she said, her voice steady with encouragement. "Yeah, but I've been thinking a lot. About my mom. And my dad, about everything I've been running from," Frank admitted. "I think I've been so focused on my body that I've been ignoring the emotional side of this journey." Sophia's voice softened, understanding immediately. "It's okay to feel that, Frank. Grief isn't something you can just get over, it's a process. And healing takes time." Frank paused, feeling the weight of her words. "I've been pushing everything down for so long. I don't know if I'm ready to face it." "You don't have to do it all at once," Sophia said gently. "Just take it one step at a time, like everything else. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Her words were a balm to Frank's raw nerves. He didn't have to rush this. He didn't have to fix it all at once. But he had to start somewhere, and that somewhere could be right here, right now. Later that day, Frank sat down with a journal, something he hadn't used much since he started this journey. But today, it felt like the right time to begin. He didn't know exactly what to write at first, but then the words just started to flow. "I don't know where to start. I don't know how to deal with this. But I know that it's time to face it. I've spent so much of my life running from the pain, burying it, thinking that if I just kept moving, I could outrun it. But the truth is, I've been carrying it with me all along. It's affected the way I see myself, the way I approach everything. I've been afraid to confront the past, but I know I can't move forward until I do. I want to be whole. I want to be free from this." Frank closed the journal, a feeling of relief washing over him. He had taken the first step. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be times when the pain felt overwhelming. But he was ready to heal. This was a part of the journey he hadn't expected, but it was one he couldn't ignore. That evening, Frank took Buddy for a short walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool, and the city felt quiet, peaceful. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally taking the steps he needed to take, not just for his body, but for his heart. The days following Frank's emotional breakthrough felt different. There was a shift, a quiet but significant change. It wasn't like a magic switch had been flipped, but he could sense it in the air. The heaviness he had carried for so long was beginning to lift, just a little bit at a time. He still had hard days, moments where the grief would hit him unexpectedly, but for the first time in a long while, Frank felt more in control of his own journey. The healing process wasn't linear, and Frank understood that. Some days felt like a step forward, and other days, a step back. But the important thing was that he was facing it now. He was allowing himself to feel the emotions he had buried for years, and that alone was a form of strength. The physical part of Frank's journey had always been the focus. Losing weight, rebuilding his strength, and improving his mobility were all measurable goals that gave him a sense of accomplishment. But as he made progress on his emotional healing, he began to notice a subtle but profound connection between his mental and physical health. He had always separated the two, his body was one thing, and his heart, another. But now, he was realizing that they were intertwined. Taking care of his emotional well-being wasn't just about dealing with the past, it was about creating a foundation that allowed him to thrive in all areas of life. One morning, as he worked through a low-impact workout designed for his knee recovery, Frank found himself lost in thought. His body was moving through the exercises with ease, but his mind was somewhere else. He thought back to the moment when he had started this journey, when everything had felt impossible. It had felt like he was facing an insurmountable wall. But now, looking back, he realized that the wall wasn't just physical. It was emotional, too. And by confronting his past, he had been tearing it down piece by piece. He was no longer just focused on his knee, his weight, or his fitness goals. He was building a life that was whole. He was learning that strength wasn't just about how much you could lift or how far you could walk. It was about how much you could carry, emotionally, and still keep going. Later that week, as Frank was chatting with Sophia on the phone, she asked him about his progress. "How are you feeling, Frank?" she asked gently, her voice warm and full of encouragement. "I feel better. I really do," Frank replied. "Physically, I'm recovering well. My knee's still not 100%, but I'm adapting. But emotionally, I think I've made more progress than I realized. I'm learning that it's not just about the physical work anymore. It's about the emotional work too." Sophia smiled through the phone. "I'm so proud of you, Frank. That's exactly it. You can't separate the two. They go hand in hand." "I never really understood that before," Frank admitted. "I've always thought of the physical side as the main thing, but the more I work through the emotions, the stronger I feel overall." Sophia's voice softened. "You've always been strong, Frank. Even when you didn't know it. This journey you're on isn't just about losing weight or getting fit. It's about finding yourself again. And I'm so glad you're doing that." The conversation stuck with Frank for the rest of the day. He hadn't realized how much he had underestimated the connection between emotional and physical strength. The two were inseparable. The way he approached his physical progress had been rooted in the same perseverance, dedication, and self-compassion that he needed to apply to his emotional healing. As the weeks went by, Frank began to embrace the idea that every step, whether it was physical or emotional, was part of the same journey. Every day, he chose to confront the fears and insecurities that had held him back for so long. Every day, he chose to take care of his body, but also his heart. One afternoon, while sitting in his favorite park bench, Frank was reflecting on how far he had come. He looked around, watching the people go by, families enjoying the warm sun, runners going for a jog, kids playing in the distance. He realized that for a long time, he had been so focused on what he didn't have, on the things that had been taken from him, that he had failed to see what he had in front of him. He had his health, his resilience, and the relationships that mattered. And more than anything, he had himself, his ability to start over, to grow, and to keep going, no matter the obstacles. As he stood up to stretch, Frank felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. His knee had been sore earlier in the week, but now it felt stronger. His workouts were progressing, and his mental state was in a better place than it had been in months. He had learned to accept his limitations, but also to push past them when he could. He was becoming more in tune with his body and his emotions, and that balance was giving him a new sense of purpose. That evening, after a long walk with Buddy, Frank sat down at his kitchen table to reflect on everything that had brought him here. He wrote in his journal, "I used to think that strength was just about physical endurance. I used to think that if I could just push through the pain, everything would get better. But now I know the truth. Strength is about balance. It's about acknowledging the emotional work that needs to be done while also taking care of the body. It's not one or the other. It's both. And when I find that balance, I'll be stronger than I've ever been." Frank closed the journal with a sense of peace. It was the kind of peace that only comes from knowing you're on the right path, even if it's not always clear. There were still challenges ahead, physically, emotionally, and mentally, but Frank was ready. He had the tools now, and more importantly, he had the mindset to keep moving forward. Frank's routine had been solid for weeks. He was waking up early, eating right, staying consistent with his workouts, and making progress with his knee. He had even started running short distances again, something he hadn't thought possible just a few months ago. Physically, he was stronger, more confident, and more hopeful than he had been in years. But despite all this progress, there was still a part of him that was waiting for the other shoe to drop. That moment came unexpectedly. It started like any other morning. Frank woke up at 6 a.m., as usual, and went through his morning stretches before his workout. The routine felt comforting now, his body knew what to expect, and his mind had learned to focus. He made a quick breakfast, fed Buddy, and headed out for a walk. The sky was overcast, and there was a light drizzle in the air, but it didn't bother him. It was just another day in his journey. Halfway through the walk, Frank's knee, which had been feeling relatively stable, suddenly gave out. 1 second, he was walking at a steady pace, the next, he felt a sharp pain shoot through his leg, and he stumbled to the ground. The suddenness of the pain took him by surprise, and he gasped, clutching his knee as he fell onto the wet pavement. He gritted his teeth against the sharp sting and tried to push through, but his leg wouldn't hold. The feeling of helplessness washed over him as he lay there for a moment, trying to breathe through the pain. His heart raced, and panic began to set in. "Come on, Frank, get up," he muttered to himself, though the words didn't carry the usual determination. He reached for his phone in his pocket and dialed Sophia, knowing she would be there for him, but his fingers trembled as he struggled to unlock the screen. Come on," he whispered, his hands slick from the rain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the screen lit up, and he hit dial. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Frank?" Sophia's voice was immediately concerned. "What happened? Are you okay?" Frank's voice was shaky. I don't know. My knee just gave out. I'm sitting here on the ground, and it hurts. I don't know what to do." Sophia didn't hesitate. "I'm coming to get you. Stay where you are. I'll be there soon." In the meantime, Frank tried to catch his breath and calm himself. The pain was starting to throb, and his mind raced. All the progress he had made over the past few months, his workouts, his routine, his mindset, suddenly felt like they had been wiped away in an instant. He had worked so hard to regain control of his life, and now, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. The doubt crept in again. Was he going to have to start all over? Would this injury set him back months? Was he destined to be stuck, always fighting against his body? The thought spiraled, and for the first time in a long time, Frank felt completely overwhelmed. When Sophia arrived a short while later, she helped him up gently, careful not to strain his knee further. She drove him back to his apartment, staying calm and reassuring as they made their way home. Once they were inside, Frank collapsed onto the couch, his knee propped up with ice. He stared out the window, the sound of rain against the glass mirroring the turmoil inside his mind. Sophia sat beside him, her presence grounding. "Hey, we'll figure this out," she said softly. "You're not alone in this." Frank's voice was quiet. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Sophia. It's like every time I get closer to where I want to be, something happens. I've been working so hard, and now this." Sophia met his gaze with a steady, calm expression. "You're not defined by one setback, Frank. This is just part of the journey. It's hard, but it doesn't undo all the progress you've made. You've come so far." He let out a bitter laugh. "It doesn't feel like it right now. It feels like I'm right back where I started. Like all of this was for nothing." Sophia shook her head. "That's not true. Progress isn't always linear. It's about resilience, about how you bounce back. You've learned so much about yourself through this journey. Now, it's time to trust that you'll get through this, too." For the rest of the day, Frank allowed himself to rest. He stayed off his knee as much as possible, icing it and keeping it elevated. But his mind wouldn't let go of the feeling of frustration. The emotional weight of this setback felt heavier than the physical pain. It was a reminder that even though he had made progress, there were still things that could knock him down. Later that evening, as Frank sat on the couch, feeling both physically and emotionally drained, he opened his journal. His hands were slow, but he began to write. I feel like I've been punched in the gut today. This setback is hard. My body let me down, and my mind is struggling to catch up. I know I've come so far, but it feels like I'm back at square one. I don't know how to keep going when everything seems to fall apart. But maybe this is part of the process too. Maybe this is where I learn what resilience really means. By the time he finished writing, Frank felt a sense of release. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know how long it would take for his knee to fully recover. But one thing was clear, he wasn't giving up. This moment of vulnerability, this feeling of being knocked down, was just another chapter in his story, not the end of it. The next day, Frank called his physical therapist and scheduled an appointment. He needed to assess the injury, but he also needed to remind himself that setbacks didn't define him. He had been through hard things before, and he could make it through this, too. Sophia's words echoed in his mind, progress isn't always linear. It's about resilience. That was the lesson Frank would hold on to, no matter what happened next. Frank had spent the last few days focused on his recovery, both physically and mentally. His knee, though still painful, was improving, albeit slowly. But that was the thing that frustrated him the most, the slowness. He had grown accustomed to the hustle, to pushing himself beyond limits, to seeing results quickly. But recovery was different. It didn't work on his timeline. Sitting in his physical therapist's office that afternoon, Frank listened intently as Emma, his therapist, explained his condition. You've had a setback, Frank. It's not unusual, especially with the intensity you've been pushing yourself with, Emma said, tapping a few spots on the chart in front of her. You've made incredible progress, but healing takes time. And time is something you need to allow yourself. Frank crossed his arms, frustrated. I know. But this feels like I've taken so many steps forward, and now, I'm back to square one. I want to get better. I want to be able to run again, to do everything I used to do. But it feels like I'm stuck. Emma gave him a sympathetic look. I get it. I really do. But healing isn't a race. It's a process. If you rush it, you'll end up back at square one, even further behind. You need to give your body what it needs, rest, recovery, and patience. The patience part is hard, I know. But that's where your strength is going to come from. Frank was silent for a moment, taking in her words. He'd always been impatient with his body. He had pushed through injuries, long hours of work, and personal struggles without ever giving himself the time he needed to heal. But Emma's words made sense. Maybe it wasn't about rushing through it, maybe it was about learning how to trust the process. Over the next few days, Frank tried to embrace Emma's advice. He focused on the small wins, the moments when he could stretch a little further, walk a little longer without pain, or complete a set of exercises with better form than the day before. But even as he focused on these little victories, a part of him couldn't shake the impatience. He wanted everything to be fixed now, and he wasn't sure how to reconcile that need with the reality of his recovery. He decided to take a step back and reflect on his journey. One evening, after a light walk with Buddy, Frank sat down with his journal, hoping to sort through his feelings. Patience is a hard thing to practice. I don't know why I've always struggled with it. Maybe it's because I've never felt like I could afford to slow down. There's always been something to fix, to achieve, to move toward. But now, I'm being forced to wait. And it's frustrating. It feels like the clock is ticking, but I can't speed it up. I have to let it run its course. And I have to trust that it's worth it. As Frank wrote, he realized something he hadn't fully understood before: patience wasn't just about waiting. It was about trust. Trusting that his body knew how to heal, that his mind could learn to handle the slower pace, and that every small step forward was a victory in itself. He paused and reread what he had written. His thoughts about impatience suddenly seemed clearer. He wasn't just battling his body's limitations, he was battling his own mindset. For years, he had equated healing and growth with speed. But maybe the true power of recovery came from being patient, allowing his body and mind to recover at their own pace, and trusting that the process was just as valuable as the result. The next day, Frank took a different approach to his workout. Instead of trying to push through more intense exercises or running to make up for lost time, he focused on gentle stretches, deep breathing, and a slower, more deliberate pace. He focused on the connection between his body and mind, allowing himself to feel each movement without rushing. As he finished his light stretching routine, he felt something shift. It wasn't a physical change, but a mental one. He felt more present, more aware of his body and its needs. He wasn't forcing himself to do more. He was simply allowing himself to be. Later that week, Sophia came by for their usual catch-up. She could tell Frank had been quieter than usual. "How are you really doing, Frank?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Frank looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm getting there," he said, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him earlier. "I'm learning to slow down. I'm learning that recovery doesn't happen on my timeline. I can't force it." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "That's such an important lesson. I think you've been so hard on yourself for so long that slowing down feels almost unnatural. But it's okay to take your time. You've come so far already. Trust that your body and mind are working together to get you there." Frank knew that Sophia was right. He had spent so much of his life fighting against time, trying to hurry up and fix everything, never allowing himself the grace to simply be. But now, with his injury and the ongoing journey of healing, he had the chance to finally learn what true patience looked like. It wasn't about sitting idly by and waiting for things to fix themselves. It was about trusting that the small steps were enough, that every day was part of a larger process. And, perhaps most importantly, it was about giving himself permission to heal, at his own pace. As Frank lay in bed that night, he felt a sense of relief. He had finally made peace with the fact that recovery, both physical and emotional, wasn't something that could be rushed. It was something to be nurtured, step by step, day by day. And though it wasn't easy, he was ready to continue that journey with patience, trust, and, most of all, compassion for himself. It had been weeks since Frank had started to accept the slower pace of his recovery. He'd learned how to adjust his mindset, how to focus on the present rather than rushing ahead. His knee was improving, the pain was subsiding, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of calm in his approach to recovery. But, as always, life had a way of throwing another curveball. It was a sunny Saturday morning when Frank decided to meet up with his old friend, Mike. They'd known each other since college, and though their lives had taken different paths, they still made time to catch up every few months. Frank had been looking forward to this meeting, eager to feel normal again, to reconnect with someone who knew him before all the struggles began. "Hey, Frank. Looking good, man." Mike greeted him with a grin as he pulled up in his car. Frank smiled and waved. "You too, Mike. It's been too long." The two of them spent the first few minutes catching up, talking about work, life, and their old college days. But as they walked through the park, chatting about the usual, Frank felt the familiar twinge of discomfort in his knee. It was nothing new. He had been dealing with it for months now, and it wasn't as bad as it had been before. He tried to ignore it, thinking that maybe it was just a temporary flare-up. They found a bench by the lake, and after sitting down, Mike leaned back and gave Frank a curious look. "So, how's the recovery going? I know you've been pushing yourself pretty hard." Frank paused, running a hand through his hair. "It's been tough. A lot harder than I thought, honestly. But I'm learning to be patient. I've had to slow down, which, as you can imagine, is not exactly my style. But I'm getting there." Mike nodded thoughtfully. "That's good to hear. But, man, you've got to watch yourself. The body's no joke. If you push too hard, you're going to hurt yourself again. You don't want that." Frank chuckled, appreciating the advice but also feeling a little defensive. I know. I'm taking it slow. I'm doing my exercises, staying consistent. It's just, there are days when it feels like I'm not getting anywhere. Mike raised an eyebrow. Sounds like you're still being pretty hard on yourself. Before Frank could respond, a sudden sharp pain shot through his knee. He winced and grabbed onto the bench, trying to steady himself. His breath caught in his throat, and he could feel the all-too-familiar frustration bubbling up inside him. Mike's expression immediately turned to concern. Hey, you alright, man? You okay? Frank forced a smile, trying to downplay the pain. Yeah, it's just the knee. Happens sometimes. It'll pass. But deep down, Frank felt a sense of dread creeping in. This wasn't just a flare-up. It was different. It was sharp, sudden, and unrelenting. He had felt it before, but now it felt like he was being pulled back into the same old cycle of pain and frustration. They sat in silence for a moment, and Frank couldn't help but feel like the weight of everything was crashing down on him. His body was betraying him again. All the work he had put in, all the time he had spent learning to be patient, suddenly felt pointless. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the road to recovery to be this unpredictable, this unforgiving. Maybe I should head home, Frank said after a while, his voice tinged with frustration. This isn't what I expected today. Mike didn't push him. Instead, he simply nodded, giving Frank space. Yeah, man. Let me know if you need anything. And don't be too hard on yourself. These things take time. As Frank walked away from the park that afternoon, he couldn't shake the feeling of defeat. The pain in his knee wasn't just physical, it was emotional, too. Every setback seemed to strip away a little bit of the progress he'd made. He had tried so hard to be patient, to slow down and let the process unfold naturally, but now, it felt like he was back at square one once again. He spent the rest of the afternoon in his apartment, trying to rest and ice his knee. But the frustration continued to churn inside him. How long could he keep going like this? How many times would he have to face setbacks before he finally saw the results he'd been working so hard for? That night, Frank lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet, but his mind was loud. He couldn't stop thinking about how this injury seemed to follow him, no matter how much he worked at healing it. It felt like an endless cycle of progress and setbacks, each one leaving him more defeated than the last. The next morning, Frank had a breakthrough of sorts. After a restless night of overthinking, he decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing on the pain and frustration, he decided to ask himself one simple question: what can I learn from this moment? It wasn't easy to shift his mindset, but Frank knew that if he wanted to continue his journey of healing, he had to stop looking at the setbacks as failures. He had to see them as part of the process, as part of the path to getting better. He pulled out his journal and began writing. I don't know what to make of yesterday's setback. But I know one thing for sure, I can't keep beating myself up over it. This is part of the journey. Healing isn't linear. It doesn't come with a clear path. And it doesn't happen on my timeline. I have to let go of the idea that I can control everything. Maybe this is just one more thing to teach me patience. I can't force it. I have to trust that my body will heal in its own time. Frank closed the journal and took a deep breath. For the first time in days, he felt a small sense of relief. He had taken the first step toward accepting the roadblock, toward seeing it not as an obstacle but as another lesson in his recovery journey. Frank had been doing everything he could to physically recover. He followed his physical therapy routine diligently, he rested when he needed to, and he kept pushing himself when he could. But despite all of his efforts, the road ahead still felt long, and the setbacks continued to weigh heavily on him. As he sat in the living room one evening, nursing his knee with a cold pack, he found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. The pain was there, sure, but something else was nagging at him. Something deeper, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. The next day, when he arrived for his physical therapy session, Emma noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. Frank's usual upbeat energy was gone, replaced by a quiet frustration that had settled over him like a cloud. "Hey, Frank. You okay today?" Emma asked, looking up from her clipboard. Frank sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I don't know. I've been doing everything I'm supposed to do. I follow the exercises, I rest when I need to, but it just feels like I'm not getting anywhere. Like something's holding me back, but I can't figure out what it is." Emma paused, her expression thoughtful. "You know, a lot of times when we experience physical pain, it's not just the body that's in pain. Sometimes, our emotions and stress can manifest physically. It's not always something we're aware of, but our mind and body are deeply connected." Frank raised an eyebrow, confused. "So you're saying it's in my head?" Emma smiled gently, sensing his skepticism. "Not necessarily. But stress, anxiety, even unprocessed emotions can contribute to how your body responds to injury. It might not just be physical recovery you need, it might be emotional recovery as well." Frank leaned back against the wall, trying to absorb what she was saying. He had always believed in pushing through pain, ignoring emotional struggles in favor of physical endurance. But what if she was right? What if all the stress he had been carrying, both from his injury and from other parts of his life, was affecting his healing? As Emma guided him through his exercises, she continued talking about the mind-body connection. "It's like this," she said, demonstrating a stretch. "When you're stressed or anxious, your body tenses up. That tension can actually slow down your healing because your muscles, joints, and nervous system are not working as they should. But if you take time to relax, to connect with your emotions, you might find that your body heals faster." Frank couldn't deny that he'd been stressed lately. Between the frustration of his injury and the pressure he put on himself to heal quickly, he hadn't given himself the time to truly process everything that had been weighing on him. The loss of his athletic lifestyle. The guilt he felt about slowing down. The fear that his best days were behind him. All of that emotional baggage had been piling up without him even realizing it. That evening, as he sat on the couch, he decided to try something different. Instead of simply icing his knee and doing stretches, he decided to meditate, something he had never really tried before. At first, it felt awkward, sitting in silence with his eyes closed, focusing on his breath. His mind kept racing with thoughts of the past few months, of missed workouts, of the pain he was still feeling. But slowly, he began to quiet his mind. He focused on his breath, feeling it enter and leave his body. He focused on the sensation of his knee, noticing the way it felt. Tense at times, but also relaxing as he took deeper breaths. For the first time in weeks, he felt his mind and body sync up, like they were working together instead of against each other. As the days passed, Frank continued to incorporate mindfulness into his routine. He meditated every morning for 10 minutes, focusing on relaxing his body and calming his mind before starting his day. He also started journaling more, allowing himself to process the emotions he had been avoiding. "I think I've been too hard on myself. I keep expecting my body to bounce back the way it used to, but that's not realistic. It's like I'm trying to push a boulder uphill, thinking that if I just try harder, it will get easier. But maybe the key isn't pushing harder. Maybe it's about learning to flow with the process. To trust it, even when it's uncomfortable." As Frank continued to embrace this new way of thinking, he noticed subtle changes. His knee felt less stiff in the mornings, and the pain, though still present, wasn't as sharp as before. He wasn't just recovering physically, he was recovering emotionally as well. One evening, when Frank met up with Sophia for their regular dinner, she could tell something had shifted in him. He seemed calmer, more at peace. "Something's different about you," she remarked, setting down her glass of wine. "You look lighter." Frank smiled, a genuine smile this time, not one tinged with frustration. "I think I've finally figured it out. I've been focusing so much on my body, on the physical part of healing, that I've ignored the emotional side. I've been carrying a lot of stress and anxiety about this injury, and I didn't even realize it. But now, I'm taking the time to process it. I'm learning how to relax, how to be patient with myself, and it's making a difference. Sophia nodded, understanding. That makes sense. It's all connected. You can't just fix your body without fixing your mind, too. I'm proud of you, Frank. The next morning, Frank woke up and immediately felt a sense of calm that had been missing for a long time. The pain in his knee was still there, but it didn't dominate his thoughts. Instead of focusing on how much it hurt or how long the healing process was taking, he focused on what he could control, his mindset. He decided to go for a light walk with Buddy, embracing the pace that his body was ready for, rather than forcing it. As he walked, he reflected on the lessons he had learned over the past few months, the importance of patience, the value of emotional healing, and the power of listening to his body. By the time he returned home, he was exhausted, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that came from growth, from understanding, from truly beginning to heal, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. Frank woke up to the sound of rain tapping softly against the window. It was a lazy Saturday morning, and for once, he didn't feel the urgent need to get out of bed. His knee was improving, slowly but surely, and his routine of mindfulness and self-care had begun to feel like second nature. The sharp pain was gone, replaced by a dull ache that seemed manageable. But that morning, as he lay there in the quiet stillness, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Despite his progress, something inside him was unsettled. He had come so far, and yet, the uncertainty of the future still loomed large. What if the pain came back? What if he couldn't return to the life he once had? Frank knew that his recovery wasn't going to be linear. He had accepted that. But that didn't make the unknown any easier to handle. He had grown accustomed to pushing through discomfort, to trying to control every aspect of his healing. But now, for the first time in a while, he had to face something he wasn't entirely sure how to handle, uncertainty. Later that morning, Frank met up with Mike at a local cafe. Mike had been his sounding board throughout this journey, and Frank appreciated the way his friend always listened without judgment. But today, Frank wasn't sure what to say. How could he explain the restlessness he was feeling, the fear that his progress could unravel at any moment? "Hey, man," Mike greeted him with a smile as Frank slid into the seat across from him. "How's it going? You look different today." Frank forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm doing okay, but I don't know. I've been thinking a lot lately. I feel like I've made so much progress with my recovery, but I can't shake this feeling that it could all fall apart. Like, what if I push too hard and make things worse? What if this pain never really goes away?" Mike raised an eyebrow. "You've been thinking about this for a while, huh?" Frank nodded, staring into his coffee cup. "Yeah. I guess I've been so focused on the physical stuff. The exercises, the rest, the routine, that I haven't really dealt with the uncertainty. The not knowing. It's like, every time I feel better, I start to worry that I might get hurt again, or that this isn't as good as it seems." Mike leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I get it. It's hard to trust the process, especially when you've been dealing with something so unpredictable. But think about it this way, you're already so much further along than when you first started. You're stronger, both physically and mentally. And sometimes, you just have to trust that things will work out, even if you don't have all the answers right now." Frank sighed, feeling the weight of Mike's words. "But what if it doesn't work out? What if I never get back to where I was?" Mike smiled gently, his eyes full of understanding. "That's the thing, Frank. You're never going to be the same as you were. But that doesn't mean you won't get better. You might not be able to control every little detail, but you can control how you respond. You've already made huge strides in your recovery. You've learned how to listen to your body, how to take things one day at a time. Trust that the rest will follow, even if it's not in the way you expect. Frank was quiet for a long moment, contemplating what Mike had said. He knew his friend was right. He had been so fixated on the fear of setbacks, on the possibility of things going wrong, that he had forgotten to appreciate how far he had come. The road had been long, and it still wasn't over, but he had learned so much about himself along the way. He had learned to be patient, to trust in the process, and most importantly, to trust that he was strong enough to handle whatever came next. Over the next few days, Frank continued his routine, but this time, something was different. Instead of approaching his recovery with the same anxiety he'd had before, he decided to embrace the uncertainty. He would keep doing the work, but he would also give himself permission to let go of the need for perfection. He would trust that his body knew what it needed, even if he didn't always understand the process. That evening, Frank decided to take Buddy for a walk, something he hadn't done in a while. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets damp and glistening under the streetlights. The air was cool and refreshing, and as they walked, Frank felt a sense of peace wash over him. As he walked, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had been on. The pain, the frustration, the setbacks, all of it had led him to this moment, this understanding. He wasn't the same person he had been before the injury, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. He had grown stronger, both mentally and physically, and he had learned to embrace the unknown, to trust that everything would unfold as it was meant to. That night, as Frank lay in bed, he realized something important: healing wasn't just about getting back to where he was before. It was about becoming something new, something better. He didn't need to control every aspect of the process. All he needed to do was show up, trust the journey, and allow himself to evolve. His knee might never be exactly the way it was before, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was moving forward, and he was doing it with patience, resilience, and an open heart. The sun was setting on another quiet evening in Frank's neighborhood. He stood at the window, looking out at the golden hues of the sky. The reflection of the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the hum of distant conversations filled the air. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos and frustration he had once felt. His knee was still sore at times, but it was manageable now, something he could live with. But it wasn't just his body that had changed. Something inside him had shifted as well. Frank had come a long way since that first doctor's visit, when he feared his athletic career was over and his life would never be the same. It had been a journey marked by pain, frustration, and doubt, but also by growth, strength, and acceptance. As he stood there, staring out the window, he realized something he hadn't fully grasped before: the person who had started this journey wasn't the same as the one standing here today. And that was okay. He had spent so much time thinking about recovery as a destination, a place he would eventually reach where everything would be normal again. But now, he understood that recovery wasn't about returning to who he had been, it was about creating something new. A version of himself who was stronger, wiser, and more resilient than before. His knee might never be the same as it was before the injury, but the lessons he had learned, about patience, about listening to his body, and about embracing uncertainty, had shaped him into someone different. Someone who wasn't defined by the past, but by the journey itself. Later that evening, he met up with Sophia at their favorite cafe. They'd been through a lot together over the past few months, and Frank was grateful for her unwavering support. But he had something he needed to share with her. Something that had been on his mind for a while. As they sat down, he looked at her, a quiet determination in his eyes. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about everything lately, about my recovery, about the way I've been handling things. And I've realized something." Sophia smiled, her eyes full of curiosity. "What's that?" "I've been so focused on getting back to who I was before the injury, thinking that if I just healed enough, everything would be fine again. But now, I see it differently. I can't go back. And honestly, I don't want to. I've learned so much along the way, and I've grown into someone I'm proud of. Someone who's not just defined by his past, but by everything he's been through to get here. Sophia reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Frank, that's beautiful. You've always been someone who pushes through, but you've also learned how to let go and trust the process. That's something not everyone can do. Frank smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. I've finally realized that healing isn't just about physical recovery. It's about emotional growth too. And the emotional side? That's where the real work happens. That night, Frank lay in bed, reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point. He had come to accept that his body would never be the same as it was before the injury, and that was okay. He didn't need to go back to the person he had been. He was becoming someone new. Someone who could embrace life's challenges with grace, patience, and strength. His knee hurt sometimes, but it no longer dominated his thoughts. He no longer saw himself as someone broken, someone who had to fight to return to a past version of himself. Instead, he saw himself as a work in progress, evolving with each step he took. As he drifted off to sleep, he realized that the healing process wasn't just about fixing something that had been broken. It was about creating a new version of himself, a stronger, more grounded version who knew that life, with all its uncertainties and challenges, was something to be embraced, not feared. In the morning, Frank woke up feeling a sense of quiet confidence. The future was still uncertain, and the journey ahead was still long. But for the first time in months, he wasn't afraid of what might come next. He trusted himself. He trusted his body. And most of all, he trusted the journey. Frank took Buddy for a walk that morning, as he had many times before. But this time, there was a new sense of peace in his stride. He wasn't looking ahead, worrying about the next step. He was simply present, enjoying the moment. The pain in his knee, though still there, no longer held him back. He had learned to walk with it, not against it. As he walked, he realized that this was the beauty of the journey. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about avoiding pain or fear. It was about moving forward, no matter what. It was about finding strength in the struggle, and peace in the process. And that was the most powerful lesson of all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What lessons have you learned from your own recovery or personal growth journey? How do you find peace in the process, even when the future is uncertain? With that, Frank's journey came full circle. He had learned to embrace not only the physical aspects of recovery but also the emotional growth that came with it. He had found strength in vulnerability, peace in uncertainty, and most importantly, acceptance in who he had become. Ready to take on whatever the future held, he walked forward with a sense of calm, knowing that the journey wasn't about the destination, it was about the person he was becoming along the way.